My name's Nick Hand and I'm a letterpress printer in Bristol. The project we're doing here with the London Review of Books is to print something to celebrate the anniversary of Shakespeare's First Folio. The LRB has shown a real interest in the kind of handmade skills of printing, even though obviously digital processes have appeared and taken over the world a little bit, sadly. Some kind of like gnarly amphibian, really. So we were really interested with this project to see if we could replicate as close as possible the processes of printing in Shakespeare's time. So it'll be like a bit of fine dentistry, I imagine.
We've got a very confusing double negative situation going on.
So we took each element and we pulled the process apart and looked at each stage. So it's got a nice inky consistency to understand some of the problems and some of the crazy things that the folks 400 years ago would have had to deal with. Very specific issues of 17th century technology. The ink that Shakespeare would have used would have been made from oak galls, which are the things that you can find on the ground this time of year, November time. So from what I know, the wasp will lay a grub inside an acorn, and the acorn forms this kind of crazy hard shell around it. And I think that it must be done to making a squirrel less interested in it. And the reason I think that is because there's no acorns here, but there's plenty of the oak galls, which is lucky for us really, because that's what we're looking for today. This tree behind me is an 800-year-old oak tree, and we're on the edge of Bristol, just next to a halls of residence. So it's phenomenal to think that this is a living thing that was 200 years old when Shakespeare was born. So the ink galls, like the ones I've collected, almost certainly would have been collected then. Pretty nuts. So there's a very good ink maker in Yorkshire called Hawthorne Printing. So I gave Michael there a call. I've read about that. I think I've got a recipe for making ink from oak galls. The oak galls are turned to powder and then they are soaked overnight. And then a couple of chemicals are added. So they're really rock hard, but the idea is to get them down into a kind of powder. So it's kind of working. They really are rock hard. Pretty weird things all in all. The difficulty is turning it into printing ink, which needs a certain kind of viscosity, and to do that we have to add a couple of more modern ingredients just to thicken it up. So we've got the really nice ground powder now. It's the perfect consistency, and we'll add iron sulfate and then we'll end up with our almost like dipping ink. And then we're going to boil it down and thicken the ink so that it's more usable. The First Folio would have been all set by hand. They worked for 2 years solid. Pretty quickly we realised that it wouldn't be possible to set that page by hand. It would have been, but it would have taken a long, long time. So we thought, instead of doing it all by hand, we thought it would be interesting to use monotype casting. And monotype casters were around for much of the last 100 years. Ellen Bills, who worked with me for 8 years, she's probably one of 3 or 4 people in the country who can use monotype casters. And I'm sure there are things that go wrong. I mean, you're working with hot lead for one thing. You key it in, that tape runs into a machine that melts the lead and then the machine magically produces lines of type using individual characters, and it just pops out one end. It's pretty fantastic. All these processes are craft skills, and Ellen is top of her game in that craft. In the 17th century, paper would have been made from rags, basically, linen rags, which were just left to rot and ferment for a while before being pulped into fibres. Again, we wanted to get back as close to Shakespeare's time as we could. For our paper, we went to St Cuthbert's Mill in Somerset. They've been making paper since the 1700s, and they use water from the River Exe, which is extremely clean, pure water. Water is a crucial ingredient in paper making, and they make the paper with 100% cotton. And Sam and Chris at the LRB have chosen a really nice paper called Somerset Velvet. Quite a heavy stock, so it's 250 gram. Letterpress printing is quite tactile, and that kind of tactility is really important in the way that ink reacts on paper. So with Somerset Velvet in particular, it's just got a very nice, beautiful quality to it.
I'm John McNaught and I make artworks for the LRB. So the illustrations used in the printing of the First Folio were carved out of wood and set alongside the typography. So we decided for our LRB print we would create a sort of woodcut illustration central on the page to be as close as we could to the actual processes in the 1600s. You do have to bear in mind the actual grain, and you have to make sure the wood allows for you to carve into that grain without it splintering. So we've got this Japanese katsura wood that's beautifully treated for printmaking, and it carves really beautifully using these bold gouges. So with the grain, it carves really nicely. But if we're going in the other direction, you then get these kind of jagged edges and splinters, which I want to avoid. Okay, so I then landed on this Japanese magnolia, which is just a harder, slightly denser wood. And experimenting with this, you can see that when we carve along the grain, absolutely beautiful cut, and then against the grain, you can feel that resistance, but it's still a nice clean edge there, which will allow us to get all the detail that we need into the print. I think this is going to be the right material for us. What you're doing is you're kind of working by carving away the kind of white space. So you start from essentially a black block, using a series of tools, carve away everything that is kind of negative space, and what you're left with is then just the original untouched surface of the print. I did a sort of digital mock-up, so I know what areas are going to be black and what areas are going to be white. Otherwise, when it's all mirror imaged and carving into the wood, it becomes quite complicated. The actual letters are actually the right way around because they're depicting printer's blocks, which are meant to be mirrored. So we've got a very confusing double negative situation going on. I thought this design was a good idea until I actually faced the reality of carving it out of wood. The multiple William Shakespeare face really is not the smartest approach.
Wow, that's beauty. So the trick is to make this type height, which is 0.917 of an inch. So I found some, we call this furniture, and this stuff is super accurate. Pretty much the right height, and it just takes it just slightly under 0.917 of an inch. and it fits really nicely. So there's two initial drop caps to put in. It's basically a case of dropping them into the text where Ellen has left a space. So it'll be like, I don't know, a bit of fine dentistry, I imagine. Bit fiddly, but kind of fun to do, and when it works it's very satisfying. Basically replacing the leading with shorter leading so that I can drop the T in. So the nice thing about this type is this is very old planting, and you can just see from the pattern of the old letter and the new type. We were looking for a press to work on that would be close to an Elizabethan press, and the nearest thing was the common press, and luckily there's a common press just up the road in Bristol at the university. Yep, so this is the start of the show, the press itself, and it's a replica, a common press made by Alan May, who was a hero of mine because he taught me at Stafford Art College in the 1970s. So the common press that we've used, it was probably about 50 or 100 years after Shakespeare's time, but presses changed so little in that time. The press would have been virtually identical. This is the bed of the press, and it's got a really beautiful litho stone under here, which is super flat, which is really important when we're printing anything. Everything about it is just sort of beautifully smooth, I guess you could say. But there's some great sort of grim sounding parts, which I kind of like, really. For example, this little bit here is called the gallows. This element here is called the coffin. Quite cheery work. So these are called the dabs, and these are what you would ink with, and you'd use two of them at the same time. This is where dab hand comes from, so the person that does the inking would have been called the dab hand. A lot of printers that use those wooden presses will actually use a leg to help the impression, so I thought I'd give that a go. To begin with, one of the problems was it was printing unevenly. It could be a bit of dust on the bed of the press, it could be something on the back of the type, and tiny little bits of dust will affect the print level. So all these things are kind of solvable, but it's just taking one at a time and then trying to kind of resolve it. I would get a good print, and then the next print wouldn't print quite as well. I couldn't kind of work out what was happening. So I tried varying the amount of ink going on and also the packing. I'd put small piece of paper in to help balance the print out. I was working with beautiful types, there's no reason why it shouldn't print. It's really interesting, the very specific issues of using, I guess, 17th century technology, or whatever the ink, would you call ink technology? Probably. So I brought it back to cylinder press with the idea that everything would be smooth from now on, but it was still, I still had a little bit of an issue. It was still, I still had a little bit of an issue. And the issue was that John McNaught's really beautiful woodcut wasn't entirely flat because it's a 10mm block of wood. At that point, just decided to print separate paths just with the text, and that was resolved everything, printed beautifully. So in the end, actually most of the printing, or at least the text and the woodcut, was printed on the proofing press here, so that we could get a better quality really in the end. But the masthead was still printed at the university on the common press. Yeah, so basically a chase is a cast iron piece of metal. Some are very old, so you can see this has got the maker's name on it, Harold. They look quite random, but like everything in letterpress, is actually not very random at all. But yeah, it will be made to fit a press, and the press will be made to fit a paper size. And that would have been the case with the First Folio as well. And then we can just lift it up and check the back feels nice and smooth, and that's ready to print really. So the idea always was to go back to the common press and print the masthead and the main head. This form of letterpress printing is the thing that Gutenberg invented in 1450. The key for that was that you could print multiple books. Suddenly people could afford to buy books. It meant that there was a democracy around readings. And 150 years later, Shakespeare did the same really. So he democratized language in a way. There's this expression that I really like of owning the means of production. And that basically means that all the tools you need are kind of here and here, and no one's telling you or dictating what you do. And you can't say that about working on a computer, because you're kind of in abeyance to the software, to the machine, to a couple of people in California somewhere. There's this sort of connection with the past all the time. Well, that's how I feel about this project, that connection. Much like, writers would do with Shakespeare. And I think our relationship with those processes that those folks happened upon 400 years ago, I have this kind of feeling for them and compassion, and I'm hoping that everyone gets a little bit of that feeling, which I'm sure they will.